My name is Lina Clifford. I'm a graduate student at UMass Amherst in the Environmental Conservation Department, and my program is focusing on forest resources. I'm Paul Catanzaro's grad student. He'll introduce himself in a second. But we're going to be talking to you today about ecological forestry and some interesting survey work that we've recently done for my master's thesis about passive forest management and family forest owners. Do you want to introduce yourself, Paul?
Sure. Oh, I guess I don't have to come over there.
You can just project for the people in the room.
Yeah. So good morning. My name is Paul Catanzaro, and I'm a forestry, that helps.
Yeah.
I'm a forestry professor here at UMass Amherst. I teach in the forest ecology and conservation program. I serve as the state extension forester, and I co-direct the Family Forest Research Center, which does research to better understand family forest owners who own the majority, particularly in the eastern U.S. All of these wonderful public benefits that we ascribe to our forests are really coming mostly off of family forest owner land. So we are interested in knowing more about those family forest owners, and that's the research we do, and Lina's research falls right into that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we good?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. All right, so this morning, we're going to talk about passive forest management. But before we get there, we want to set the context by talking about ecological forestry. We feel as though there, for too long, has been an adversarial, I guess, if you will, relationship between active forest management and passive forest management. And I'm in this camp or I'm in that camp, and our forest does that and our forest does that. And we don't see it like that. And so what we want to do today is try to provide you a framework, ecological forestry, for how we see these two things fitting together. Because, spoiler alert, here's the take-home message, we need both. We need both on the landscape. They each provide important benefits and values to us as humans, and we need both. And so to us, the conversation is, well, how do we do that in these complicated family forest owner dominated landscapes? So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and Lina will be talking about her work, which is the only work that we know of in the United States that's actually looked at this. Let's start off with at the large scale. So there have been, this is the United Nations Biodiversity Conference that was held not that long ago, talking about the biodiversity crisis globally. Just this crash of species that we're seeing, and with that crash of species, we're all very concerned about the crash of ecosystems and benefits and values and so forth. So part of these international calls for this biodiversity crisis is not only protecting land, but protecting a large portion of it in this passive approach, in these reserves and things. And so from an international perspective, we're receiving recommendations that, yeah, this is a good thing. We should be looking at this. From a national perspective, of course, if you're not familiar, this is Biden's 30 by 30 initiative. The president's initiative is challenging at the state level to conserve up to 30% of land and waters across our country for the green infrastructure, all the wonderful benefits that our lands provide. And an important part of that 30 by 30 is making sure there are enough reserves out on the landscape. So both at the international and the national level, there's more conversation about these reserves. At a regional level, there has been calls through the Wildlands and Woodlands vision that's been led by Harvard Forest over the last 10 or 20 years to think about our landscapes in a way that utilizes both wildlands, appropriately on the landscape, but also some functioning woodlands as well. So Wildlands and Woodlands actually starting to integrate these two together. But certainly, whether it be the international level, the national level, or regionally, we are starting to hear more conversation about passive forest management for its many benefits and what that means. I'll take one more step down in terms of scale. There have been growing conversations at the state level with the Healey administration about the crucial role that forests play in terms of climate change. And one of those things, one of the many initiatives that the governor has set forth is forest as a climate change solution, includes the expansion of forest reserves. And there's a recognition that public lands certainly play an important role, and they do. And there are reserves designated across the state on public lands, and they're having conversations as to whether or not that's an appropriate level of reserves. But there are also conversations about where else in the landscape might there be reserves, these forest reserves, that can complement the reserves on state lands. So, point being, there have been growing conversations about passive management, and it's a topic we are really interested in knowing more about. The next couple of slides, the intent of which is to give you some background as to the ecology of our current forests, to give you a sense of what the end goal is. Like, what are we really trying to accomplish out in this landscape from an ecological perspective? I just want you to have just a sense of, we can't understand where we're going without better understanding how we got to where we are now. And so I just want to put up a couple slides that talk about land use history, that talk a little bit about ecology. I'll dip my toe in there and then we'll bot back out, but then we'll bring that together at the end of the presentation. It was not that long ago that I would have started with this slide, but I think it's hugely important to recognize that humans have been interacting with forests for thousands of years across our forested landscapes. So there have been rich indigenous cultures interacting with forests across our landscapes, and if you haven't been to this site, I would highly recommend it, showing estimates of where indigenous populations' homelands are. So I put this slide up to remind us that there have been interactions. People have been interacting with forests for thousands of years. Generally speaking, it's generally agreed that the intensity or the amount of interaction with these forests are within the norms of historical range of variability, meaning that the natural processes of the forest were really still the drivers of forest and forest change. That, of course, changed dramatically in that colonial land use history period, where we had clearing first for subsistence farming, and then in the mid-1800s, we had market economy farms where produce was being grown and lots of pastures, and most of the landscape would have been cleared. And then we had this reversion back to largely white pine for a number of reasons on our landscape. And then we had this second wholesale clearing of our landscapes. Many of you probably know this story. This has had a profound impact on our forests that we're still sort of recovering from today. This is some work that was done by Mark Ducey up at UNH and some of his colleagues that used the U.S. Forest Service forest inventory and analysis data to age our forests. And please recognize that the study was from 2013. So we're about, if you can, in your mind's eye, move that bell curve over to the right a little bit, you'll see that there is a huge amount of forests that are about 100 years old. And that complements very well with what we know about our land use history, that we had this wholesale clearing in a relatively short amount of time from an ecological perspective, right? Over the course of decades or a century, we went from, these wonderful, what we now call old growth forests, but we had these wonderful complex forests to pasture, back to now these 100-year-old forests, which in some of these photos down below are meant to communicate to you that are fairly homogeneous and simplified relative to what we would have expected pre-colonial land use history. So the past extent of old growth forests in our landscape would have been something around 90% of the landscape. So most of our landscapes would have been in this old growth condition across Massachusetts and beyond. So when we think about our species, whether they be flora or fauna, these are the conditions that the vast majority of our species would have evolved with. So I just want to show just one slide relative, and this comes from a textbook I use in my forest resources management class from Jerry Franklin and his colleagues out in the Pacific Northwest. But this is just meant to show you succession through time. So there is a large disturbance, let's call it a wind disturbance, And a number of the trees, maybe most of the trees in the forest, are laid down. But importantly, not all of the trees are laid down. Not everything's gone. This is what we call biological legacies, okay? And even the trees that are killed, some of them remain standing, some of them remain on the ground. We have smaller trees that probably wouldn't have gotten killed because of the disturbance. We've got seed in the seed bank. We've got lots of biological legacies post-disturbance. Right? This idea of a stand replacing disturbance is sort of a miscommunication. Our forests have grown up over time with high frequency, low intensity kinds of disturbances. And our species, whether they be trees or plants or animals, have evolved with that. And so what we see is forests start regrowing. Our forests have a remarkable capacity to regenerate. And so they start regrowing. And what you'll see, I hope, is that parts of the forest that remain, those biological legacies, become a part of the new forest that is created, if you will. Right? So not everything is lost. And I'll show you in a few minutes, those legacies sort of move through time. The other reason I want to show you this slide is because I want to give you the sense, again, based on that last slide, our forests are generally at about 100 years, right? We don't really know how old our trees get. I have a colleague at Harvard Forest who spent the summer coring trees, and he found a tree, a black birch, that was 200 to 300 years old. I never would have thought that a black birch, would live to 200 to 300 years old. Now, obviously, he didn't core a population. He cored a single tree. Maybe that's an outlier. I don't know. But I think we really just don't know how old our trees in our forests will get. So my point being, there is no end point to this. And what happens through time is that our forests grow in greater complexity as parts of the forest die through different disturbances. Other parts live and move into the next generation. That's what these yellow lines are meant to communicate, that there are parts, that there's a tree here that continues to grow later in the forest. There are down dead wood that continues later in the forest. There's young trees in the understory that are now the big trees, 100 years later. So nature never cleans the slate and starts at square one. There are all these biological legacies. And what ends up happening in the forest through time is we grow complex forests and oftentimes great diversity, okay? So we grow lots of complexity, and there is great continuity between stages of forest. There are trees that last, dead wood that lasts, regeneration that lasts, and so forth, okay? I'll pick up on that point in a moment. There are some general characteristics that we see in old growth forests, including, because of that regular high frequency, low intensity types of disturbances, we see diversity of tree sizes and ages. When people think about old growth, of course, the first thing that comes to our mind is big trees, logical, right? And old trees, logical, and that certainly are important characteristics. But these are dynamic systems. So we also see young trees. We also see white birch that likes a lot of sunlight. So we see lots of trees of different ages, of different sizes across the landscape. We see lots of spatial variability. So we see what we would say these forests are gappy or patchy. So that's a LiDAR photo taken of old Big Reed up in Maine by John Hagan and his group. For those of you not familiar with LiDAR, the orange and the yellow are tall trees, and the blues and the greens are short trees. The take home from that is it's patchy, right? We got some areas where the trees are tall, and we got other areas where there was a recent disturbance that the trees have been, regenerating. So it's not even, it's not homogeneous, it's not simplified. It has a lot of complexity to it. Those disturbances also obviously create mortality, which leads to dead snags, dead down logs, and so forth. So there are these characteristics within our forests. And these characteristics that we can attain through one pathway, through active, passive forest management, include things like late successional habitat and biodiversity. Now, in our part of the world, we don't have a charismatic, obligate old growth species like they do in the Pacific Northwest with the spotted owl. Frankly, there hasn't been, though, a lot of work done in this area in the Northeast, in part because our forests are so young. But we do provide a different kind of habitat in these areas, or the forest provides it for us, I should say. Carbon storage is maximized in these areas because there's just a lot of carbon packing with that vertical diversity. Trees are bigger, down dead wood, all of that is storing carbon. These areas provide really important benchmarks for our forests. What happens if we do nothing? Like what's the control? Like we're over here doing, different kinds of things, but what would happen if we did nothing? And so having some places out on the landscape that offer us that benchmark are hugely important. And I guess one of the last things I would add is sort of this human element. People really like big trees. People really like, old growth forests. They love seeing the moss and the lichens and those sorts of things. And so that's something that's very real, right? We've got to listen to that. But these kinds of forests don't provide us everything we need. So one of the publications, actually, we just came out this week, it's at the Masswoods table if you're interested, is a publication we call Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, which helps to quantify the amount of wood we're producing in Massachusetts relative to how much we're consuming. And in Massachusetts, we are voracious consumers of wood, even relative to other countries that have similar forest types and similar population to forest ratios. We still consume much more than other countries. And we produce 5 to 17 times less than those other countries. We need to take responsibility for our own consumption. Part of that, of course, is reducing our consumption. But the other part of that, I would suggest, is that we need places where we can also, in an ecologically responsible way, produce at least some of what we're using. If this is of interest to you, you can read the publication. But my point with this slide is that we can't get everything from any one stage of forest. So this is a diagram we put together for a forest carbon publication. It's the forest succession clock. So if a big disturbance is 0 and the forest starts regrowing, our trees become different age at, obviously at 0, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. At different parts of the forest age, there are different benefits that are maximized. Okay? So from a carbon perspective, that dark green, carbon sequestration is maximized somewhere when the forest is like 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. It doesn't ever stop sequestering carbon, but that's when it really maximizes it. But carbon storage is maximized at a couple hundred years. If you're interested in early successional habitat, that happens at like ages 0 to 15. That's not late successional habitat. That doesn't happen until age 200 to 300. So recognize that at different parts of forest development, there are different benefits that are maximized. So what I would suggest to you is that if we want all of the benefits forests provide, we need a diversity of strategies to maintain places on our landscape at various points in the clock. These are quotes that we used to put at the end of the presentation, and then at one point, we realized this is really what it largely comes down to. And so in Leopold's words, he would say, we're missing some cogs and wheels from our forests, right? We have simplified, homogeneous forests. They're 100 years old, not 400, 500, 600 years old. We don't have all of the complexity and parts in our forests. And as Kimmerer so astutely points out, that there is a relationship that is a part of taking, right? We expect a tremendous amount from our forests. We expect clean water and carbon and biodiversity and wood products and all of those things. What are we giving back? What's that reciprocity? Like, how are we helping the forest? And so I think together these, to me at least, help frame ecological forestry. So in ecological forestry, we use the template that nature gives us to try to mimic natural processes. So we're trying to recruit more diversity, more complexity across the forest, so we can help return forests to the way they evolved, in the hopes that they will be better able to sustain the values they provide for us, but also sustain themselves through the challenges we face. Invasive plants, invasive insects, climate change. Having all of the cogs and wheels within the forest, I would suggest, is an important part of helping our forests through these challenges. There are 4 principles to ecological forestry, focusing on complexity, making sure that we're increasing the complexity within the forest, and that complexity part includes diversity. So we want lots of different layers vertically, low, mid, high, and we want complexity horizontally, right? Old growth is patchy. So we want some areas that have trees growing close together, some where they're spread out, and some in between. So complexity is something we focus on. Continuity. Remember that diagram I showed you. Nature never wipes everything clean. There are always biological legacies. So as we approach forest stewardship, we need to identify those parts of the forest that are special, those parts of the forest that frankly take decades, centuries to develop. You know, a big tree that has wonderful cavities for biodiversity, that is a substrate for lichen and mosses, that takes centuries to develop, right? Why take that away from the forest? Let that continue through the forest, use nature as a model. Time, we need to rethink our time. We need to think through and consider, right, things take decades, things take centuries. When are we intervening into these ecosystems, and what timetables are they running on to perpetuate their complexity, their diversity, and particularly in this landscape of thousands of family forest owners, as Lina will show, it is really important to think about when you're making decisions about the land you're making decisions on, whether it be town land, land trust land, your own land, your family's land. How does your land fit within the context? How does it connect or not connect? And what are the opportunities? So that's a lot of background. The hope is to communicate to you today that within ecological forestry, it includes the entire spectrum of do nothing, because we need that out on our landscape, but we also need other values that can be continued or created through active forest management. So rather than having a fight about, well, I'm an active management person, or I'm a passive person, I would encourage us to think about how these two work together, because they're not adversarial. They work to fulfill, sort of the same large-scale benefits across the landscape, in the sense that they complement one another. Areas that are passively managed will have some benefits that those that are actively managed won't, and vice versa. And so we need both across the landscape, and part of what we wanted to do is better understand that passive piece. Because in Lina's work, we weren't really able to find people that have focused on this passive piece and what landowners feel about. And landowners are hugely important. So I think I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah. So this is an example of the context that we're thinking about ecological forestry through. So all of this green is forest cover in an example of northwestern Mass. So we've got a lot of forest to work with. And there are great proportions of municipal lands and land trust lands, state lands, that really provide an anchor point in the landscape. But when you lay on that parcel layer, it's a highly parcelized landscape, and it's dominated by family forest owners. So if we want to maintain these benefits that we rely on from our forests, we need to engage these folks who are the in-between matrix between these anchor points in order to make that happen. As Paul said, there's been a lot of great research on family forest owner attitudes about active approaches, because that's long been recognized as a way to maintain these forest benefits. But no one, at least in the US, has looked at family forest owner attitudes towards taking an intentionally passive approach, which importantly is different from a sort of do nothing by default, but deciding this is the strategy that I'm going to take. And because this is the other side of that ecological forestry coin, we wanted to ask family forest owners, the folks who own so much of the forests in the Northeast and New England, what they thought about it. So we're going to get into the survey. We had 4 main research objectives for this project. First, we wanted to know, are family forest owners interested? If they are interested, how many of them are interested? We wanted to know what tools were most appealing to them for adopting passive forest management. So we looked at things that are existing on the landscape today, between current use, tax incentive programs, to CRs. And then we wanted to understand the characteristics of family forest owners associated with an increased intention to adopt passive forest management. And then what do family forest owners see as the benefits to passive and the concerns when it comes to passive forest management? So to do this, we developed an old-fashioned mail survey that we mailed out to folks. And this involved 5 broad stages. First, we collected landowner address data. We used a service called LandVision, so we were able to download. I spent a whole summer downloading all of the addresses in New England that matched certain criteria. We then conducted a series of key informant interviews. The goal with this stage was to develop our definition for passive forest management, because depending on who you ask, it varies a little bit in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And it was also important for us to understand from both landowners who had done passive forest management projects and land protection professionals alike who had done acquisitions work or CRs, what are the challenges with passive and what are the opportunities? Stage 3 was pre-testing the survey, so we sent many drafts back and forth, wordsmithing the questions, but we wanted to make sure that the folks that we were sending the survey to understood what we meant and were interpreting it in the way that we had intended. So we had folks join us on Zoom, read the questions out loud, think about their answers out loud, and that helped us to refine the survey so that we were finally able to send it out in March. And so we sent out our survey to a stratified sample of 2,600 family forest owners in New England. Our sample was stratified based on the proportion of family forest owner land in each state. This meant that a lot of our sample came from Maine. And we also stratified based on acreage above or below 50. So we had some smaller landowners in our sample and then some larger landowners as well. And then we had to collect all of those surveys back and analyze the data. So I won't get into it too much, but we did some group comparisons looking at the folks who are interested in passive and the folks that are not, how they differ from one another. We did some testing to ensure that the folks who didn't respond to the survey were not significantly different from the folks who did. And then we also created some models that we'll talk about to see what characteristics turn up or turn down intention to adopt the 4 different tools that we proposed. So passive forest management, like Paul was saying, the main intention here is letting nature be the main driver of what happens on the land, rather than human intervention being that driver. So we developed this definition for the survey, and we developed this largely in conversations with John Leibowitz from the Northeast Wilderness Trust. And so really the main things that are not allowed are timber harvesting for commercial or personal use, motorized vehicle recreation, like using ATVs on the property, and building structures. Conversely, things like hiking and bird watching, invasive plant management, collecting berries or sap for personal use, and hunting are all allowed within our definition for passive. So to achieve our research objectives and to learn more about family forest owners and how they felt about passive, we had several survey sections. We're not going to talk about all of them, but just to give you a sense of the kind of data that we collected. This is also a picture of all of the surveys right before they went to the mail. We asked about general questions about the land, things like acreage, whether they live on their forested property. We asked about their goals for their land using a series of Likert scales. So we said ranging from not at all important to very important, how important is this goal to you? We asked about what activities they had done on their land in the past and what activities they plan to do on their land in the future. Some demographic things, and then the main meat of the survey were these 4 hypothetical scenarios that we'll get into next. And then lastly, we asked about their perceived concerns and benefits. So we gave folks 4 hypothetical scenarios through which they could adopt passive forest management on their land. Importantly, the definition of passive remained the same across all 4 scenarios, but the things that did change were these 4 items at the top of this table. So the first scenario that we gave folks was to voluntarily decide to manage some or all of their land passively. So there's no formal program, no incentive necessarily in terms of a monetary sense. And this is temporary, so they could decide at any point to stop doing this. The second scenario is a current use program, which many of you might be familiar with, like a Chapter 61 sort of thing, but aimed at passive forest management. So they're enrolled in a formal program. They have to manage their land passively in order to get that tax break. We told them that they would get up to 90% of their property taxes, that reduction, and then this would be a temporary scenario as well. So they could leave, but they would have to pay some penalty back taxes. The third situation was a conservation restriction or legal agreement scenario where they're legally required to manage some or all of their land passively. They would maintain ownership of the land still, and they would receive a one-time payment for their development rights, and this would be a permanent scenario. And then lastly, we gave folks an option where they could sell their land to a conservation organization who would then manage it passively. So they no longer own the land, no longer pay taxes, and this would be permanent. For each of these scenarios, we asked folks if they would adopt this approach on some or all of their land, to which they could say no, yes on some of my land only, yes on all of my land, or I'm already doing this. And we also asked folks about how certain they were about their answer. So now I'm going to get into some of the characteristics that kind of help us define the folks who responded to our survey. We had a 26% cooperation rate, which is pretty standard for the type of survey that we developed. The average acreage, forested acreage, was 123 in the state. Most folks lived on their forested property. The average age was 66, and then we had a gender split, nearly 70% men, 30% women. These characteristics, as well as the goals and past activities data that I'll show you in a second, show us that our respondent pool is pretty standard. They're very similar to the folks who respond to the National Woodland Owner Survey. So we think that we have a pretty representative group and not some funky subset of family forest owners. So this is our goals data. It's really hard to see, but this leftmost bar is showing folks saying the importance of biodiversity on their land. So this was one of the highest rated goals, followed very closely by connection to nature and then privacy and rural traditions. And then we saw that many folks had done non-motorized recreation, that's on the far left there, things like hiking and snowshoeing. Many folks had also harvested firewood from their land and hunted on their land. And so these types of characteristics show us, again, that folks are similar to those in the National Woodland Owner Survey and that they're a representative group. So who is interested in passive forest management? We saw that 36% of our respondents would do at least one of the scenarios that we proposed with certainty. 21% rejected them across the board. 38% rejected some of the scenarios and then were uncertain about other scenarios. And then 5% simply didn't answer the survey, the hypothetical scenario portion of the survey, but answered other parts. So let's dive into this 36% a little bit deeper. We wanted to understand who are these folks and how do they differ from those who are not interested in adopting passive. The folks who are interested in adopting at least one were significantly different from others in the following ways. So when it comes to demographics, they had higher incomes, they had higher education levels. They rated the following goals as extremely or very important more often than those who are not interested in adopting passive, so things like connection to nature, protecting wildlife, mitigating climate change. They more often rated goals for wood production and hunting as not at all important. And they more often had plans to engage in non-motorized rec, invasive insect and plant management, and a conservation easement, more so than folks who are not interested in passive. And they less often had plans for motorized recreation. So we find that these folks are not disengaged landowners necessarily. Some past research has talked about passive landowners, sort of the passive by default folks, and have said that these people are disinterested from their land, they're not engaged. But we can see that these folks who are interested in adopting this intentional passive approach have strong goals for their land and plans for their land in the future. Not everyone in this 36% was interested in adopting passive on all of their land. It's actually, there were significantly more folks interested in adopting passive on only some of their land. We thought this was really interesting. When we were first developing the survey, we were wondering if folks would even think about their land in that way, of managing one way on one portion and another, but clearly they are. So we see that 23% of our total respondents would do at least one of the scenarios on some of their land only, never all of their land. And then there's this dedicated 12% of our total respondent pool who are interested in adopting passive across their entire property. And both of these kinds of people are important to have on the landscape. So we'll talk about another group comparison, those folks who rejected all of the scenarios compared to everyone else. So the folks that rejected all of the passive scenarios were more often male, they had higher incomes, they had less or lower education levels than those who did not reject all the scenarios. Goals for hunting were more often very important for these folks, while connection to nature, wildlife habitat, and reducing climate change effects were less often rated to be very important. The folks that rejected all of the passive scenarios more often had plans for motorized recreation, firewood collection, and hunting, and less often had plans for non-motorized rec and conservation easements. So this kind of makes sense. The folks who are not interested in the passive approach, they have plans to do things that are not allowed within our definition of passive. So motorized recreation, ATV use, firewood collection, which is a big thing that we'll come back to in a second. So we'll wipe that slate clean, and now we're going to talk about who's already doing passive on the landscape. We found that 21% report already doing passive forest management, while 79% of folks are not. No one has quantified this number before, at least in the US, so this is interesting to see. There are a few characteristics that define these folks from others. So the folks already doing passive were more often female, they had less of their annual income coming from their woods, and they had higher education levels. Similar to those folks who were interested in passive but not already doing it, they rated goals for connection to nature, wildlife habitat, climate change mitigation as very important or extremely important, more often than those not already doing passive. They have plans for non-motorized rec and conservation easements more often, and less often had plans for hunting and commercial timber harvest. Again, this makes sense. We can see commercial timber harvest that wouldn't be allowed within this definition of passive, and having really strong ecological goals. So this just shows again that we're talking about an intentional passive approach rather than a do-nothing by default. So this is a table showing how the tool preference part of our study shook out. So you can see here we've got voluntary on the far left, then the current use scenario, the conservation easement scenario, and the fee simple scenario. The darker green colors at the top are yes responses with certainty. And then we've got the lighter green showing folks already doing the approach, the brown being certain no, and then folks being uncertain. The current use scenario was by far the most popular. It was significantly more popular than any of the other approaches for adopting passive management. This isn't a really big surprise because it's temporary but also offers some financial benefit. The fee simple option was very unpopular, with 54% of our respondents rejecting it. And then we see that most folks, if they're already doing passive forest management, it's through this voluntary approach. There's no formal program. They're not being required to manage their land in that way. They're just deciding to do that on their own. And I'll just add one last thing on this slide. You can see for every scenario, adopting the scenario on some land, that second chunk of green is greater than all land. So that trend was consistent throughout all four scenarios. There were some regional differences to highlight. So a significantly greater proportion of southern New England respondents report already doing the voluntary scenario compared to the northern New England states. And we saw a significantly greater proportion of southern New England and Vermont respondents saying that they would adopt the the current use scenario. Because of the way that we pulled our sample, we had to group together southern New England, and we were able to compare southern New England to Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. So for concerns, we gave folks kind of a laundry list, well, a 9-item laundry list of things that they might be concerned about when it comes to passive. These items were developed through our key informant interviews at the beginning of our process, and 89% of our respondents had at least one concern when it comes to passive forest management. The average number of concerns checked was just over 3 out of the total 9, and these are the results when it came to the concerns. So firewood, by far, firewood as well as limited land use for future owners. Those were the top 2 concerns. And this stayed the same, interestingly, no matter how we slice the data, if we were looking at it regionally, if we were looking at folks who were interested in adopting passive or the folks who rejected all the scenarios, these were the top 2 concerns across the board. For benefits, similar deal. We gave folks a list and said check all that apply, and these benefits were derived from our key informant interviews. 80% of folks saw benefits, so 89% saw concerns, 80% saw benefits. So it's a mixed bag. The average number of benefits checked was nearly 3 out of the 6. And old forest habitat, letting nature take its course, and seeing a forest's natural appearance were the top benefits. So now we'll get into the scenario models. It's kind of a lot of information, but we'll distill it down on the slide after this. We grouped people into certain yes and certain no. So the people who were uncertain about their response, we left those folks out of these models. We grouped together goals into the following categories. So we had a biological and amenities goal group. So things like climate change or biodiversity, privacy, so that was in that group. We had a recreation goals group, so that was hunting, non-motorized recreation, those types of things. And then we had a financial goals group, folks that were concerned about wood production on their land or financial security from their land for themselves or their family. And so we put these variables, as well as a few others, into these models and found the following. So when it came to the voluntary scenario, there were 3 significant variables that either turned up or turned down adoption. The number of benefits that the person saw to passive forest management increased the likelihood that they would do it voluntarily, while the number of concerns decreased their likelihood. And then folks who had strong financial goals are less likely to adopt the voluntary approach. This makes sense. If you're not being paid to do something like this on your land and maybe you're foregoing some timber income and financial goals are important to you, you're not going to be as likely to adopt this voluntary approach. For the current use or property tax reduction scenario, the number of benefits and the number of concerns, same role there. But we see that having a bachelor's degree or higher, as well as being enrolled in a current use program, increase the likelihood of adopting the current use passive scenario. This makes sense. There's past research that shows that if you have awareness or familiarity of a program, you're more likely to adopt it. So folks who are in maybe a standard current use program, they already know how current use works. They're going to be more likely to adopt this passive current use program. And then having a bachelor's degree, we know that having a college education, more education is helpful when it comes to these more formal management or conservation-based estate planning tools. On the other hand, recreation goals, interestingly, decrease the likelihood that the person would adopt the current use scenario, and the northern states were less likely to adopt it as well. The conservation easement, very similar deal when it comes to the number of benefits, the number of concerns. Having a bachelor's degree, being enrolled in current use, those things stayed the same. But then there was this additional significant variable, which was having plans for a conservation easement. This is similar to what we've talked about before with having familiarity or plans for a program. They're familiar with how conservation restrictions work. And then lastly, this fee simple scenario, there were a lot of significant variables. A lot of things stayed the same, but a few things to note here. Financial goals increased the likelihood of adopting a fee simple scenario where they would sell their land to a conservation group who would then manage it passively. Plans for invasive plant management also interestingly increased the likelihood of adopting this fee simple option. Having goals for in that biological kind of amenity goal group decreased the likelihood. This could be because you can't enjoy your land if you don't own it. And then northern states were less likely to adopt the fee simple scenario. So that was a lot. A few highlights. We included other variables that were not significant in any of the scenario models. So things like acreage, gender, income, plans for hunting or firewood, motorized recreation plans. None of these were significant in any of the scenario models. We talked about how the benefits and concerns were consistent across all of the scenarios and how education was important for the formal tools. I think we've touched on most of these things, so I'm just going to blast through. But the last point here, different goals have different impacts, and we know that landowners have different goals in different situations, different scenarios. So having a variety of tools to meet landowners where they're at, I think, is important. So overall, we learned that there's a mixed willingness to adopt passive forest management. Just like not everyone's interested in active forest management, not everyone is interested in taking this intentionally passive approach. 36% of our respondents would do at least one of the scenarios, and 21% of folks rejected them all. Across the board, for each of the scenarios, adopting passive on some land was much more popular, significantly more popular than adopting it on all land. This has good outcomes for ecological forestry, which we'll talk about in a second. Current use was the most popular tool for adopting passive. And as I said before, having different tools for different types of landowners, our models show that depending on their goals, their planned activities, there's different knobs that turn up and down the adoption of each of these tools. We need to have options for landowners. And lastly, we see that in the characteristics that define the folks who are already doing passive or the folks interested in doing passive, what makes them different from others, we see that we're not talking about a passive by default, but rather taking an intentionally passive approach to the land. And that these folks are not indifferent landowners, but they have really strong goals for their land and plans for their land in the future. So what does this mean for ecological forestry? As Paul was talking about at the beginning, rather than seeing active and passive forest management as these black and white options, ecological forestry encourages us to see them as a spectrum of shades of green. So you could have wildlands, permanently protected property at one end of the spectrum, and then you could have a property that's totally actively managed. And we need to have both of those, as well as all of the gradations in between across the landscape. So you could have a property that's passively managed. You could have a reserve area within a property, so this might be half of the property perhaps. You could have a passively managed stand, so maybe it's just one portion, a small portion of your forest. Those two things might be very similar depending on the size of your woods, the size of your property. And then there's also mixing active and passive approaches across your forest. It could be a really interesting regular shelterwood approach for those silviculture geeks out there. There's different ways that we can incorporate these approaches together across an entire property. So rather than viewing, just to really hone in on this, rather than viewing active and passive as opposed to one another, here's the shades of green again. So you can imagine that these are intensively managed sites here at the south, and then passive reserve areas up north and to the east. And maybe these can be our state lands, our municipal lands, our land trust lands that are providing these really great anchor points on the landscape. We know that there's a dedicated portion of our respondents, about 12%, who are interested in adopting passive on all of their land. There's significantly more folks interested in adopting passive on only some of their land. And then the folks who said, nope, I'm not interested in passive at all. And having these gradations across the landscape is what we need in order to sustain the diversity of forest benefits that we rely on, and can help us to achieve those different portions of that succession clock, having young forest, old forest, forests that have patches of that in between. Hand it back to you.
Yeah. And so this is the glass is half full, right? I mean, it'd be really, sometimes when I show the slide of all the parcels across the landscape, it's sort of that, how do we reach all those people? Like, it's such a complicated landscape. But the glass is half full is that we need a variety of approaches, strategies across the landscape to achieve and sustain the diversity of goals and values we're looking for. And as it turns out, glass is half full, landowners are interested in a diversity of things. And so there are opportunities, I think, to cultivate that diversity with landowners. In particular, let's go back, let's bring it back around. Our forests are homogeneous. They're oversimplified, right? And they're ecologically young. So we want to cultivate that structural complexity, that diversity in our forests, and we want to do that in a variety of ways. There are going to be some people that are interested in contributing to that by designating maybe their whole land as passive. That's great. Let natural disturbances be the driver, things will change, and over time we'll have that. There'll be other landowners, there were twice as many landowners, that were interested in doing passive on some, but active on the other. Great. Those active areas are areas that we might be able to gain more early successional habitat, regenerate shade-intolerant species that we wouldn't normally do with passive, that might be better adapted to climate conditions. There might be areas that we're getting wood production out of. And then there are landowners that are interested in sort of the mix of those, as Lina said, so that they're doing silviculture, but they're applying those ecological strategies, those ecological forestry strategies of keeping legacy trees in the middle of the stand, keeping patch reserves and things across the landscape. And so what we end up with is a mosaic of age classes and a mosaic of species, an increasing abundance of structural diversity across the landscape. And all of that is what we need to restore back to our forests to sustain all of these many benefits. Now, some of this we just don't have control over, right? I mean, a landowner's going to do what a landowner's going to do, but there are opportunities to be thoughtful about this approach, particularly if you're a land trust, municipality, state agency. There are some areas on the landscape that are probably better to do early successional forest management than there are areas that are better to do the passive approach. On the left is an aerial photograph showing the Eugene Moran Wildlife Management Area, and that polygon in red shows the area that they identified as adding to existing early successional habitat. From a biodiversity perspective, having more of that habitat is good. Why go into a forest block and create early successional habitat as opposed to adding to existing habitat that's abutting it? Likewise, on the right-hand side, I have a map that's showing a property, a parcel that a colleague of mine and I have some research plots on. And one of the reasons we chose that property is because its landscape position is abutting some state lands that generally takes a passive approach. So we're adding to that, we're surrounding, or we're complementing the core of that state land by encouraging more of this complex structure through some active and passive approaches over there. So there are some areas on the landscape as you take a look at where your specific land is, if you're a landowner, or maybe you're a land trust that has multiple fee properties. Take a look. What's around there? What can you add to? In what way can you add to that landscape?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So Paul was talking about the connectivity piece and playing off of what's already there on the landscape. There's some other recommendations that we can think about when citing passive forest management. Having passive reserve areas on a variety of physiographic sites is important. Just like having protected land on a variety of physiographic sites is something to work towards. Having reserve areas that are on high, hilltops, reserves that are at the bottom of a valley, along a slope, on different soil types, different bedrock types. This is important. We can also think about the health of the forest before we're designating it as passive. So we want it to be set up for success. We don't want to have, abundant hay-scented fern, for example, that's going to impede, future regeneration of trees. Existing old growth characteristics can be an interesting place to site passive. You can see this interesting structure here. That's not something that you can cut your way to, maybe if you're like a wood sculpture person, but these take a long time to develop on the landscape, and so we can try to augment that with passive areas around. Riparian areas are another kind of no-brainer when it comes to passive forest management. A lot of foresters are doing this already, creating filter strips around riparian areas. And then lastly, sensitive ecological sites could be for consideration for passive forest management. If you have vernal pools, or maybe there's some important habitat for threatened or endangered species, this could be an important area to consider for passive.
Can you just go back? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I just want to continuity and complexity, right? So where on your property do you find things that have taken centuries to develop? if we don't have to start from scratch, why start from scratch? So identify those areas that are already complex, that have that uniqueness to them that takes decades or centuries to get to, and build off of those.
Mm-hmm. I think this is you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Likewise, there are opportunities in the landscape. There are also some challenges, and Lina touched on this. But the assumption with the passive management approach is that forests will get from where they are now to a state that is complex, structurally and otherwise. Right. That's the assumption, and through thousands of years of evolution, that's what our forests have always done. We're entering sort of a new age. I don't know what invasive plants and invasive insects have in store for us. There are some examples of some heavily infested forests that aren't regenerating the way we would like to see them. And so there may be sites where we really do need that active intervention, that if you just set it off on succession and let it go, we may not get to where we think it'll go. And I would say the same for deer browse, we can't, I don't think we can assume that if you just take a passive approach, it's going to get to that successional endpoint that we're hoping for, that we see in terms of getting all of those wonderful old growth-like characteristics. And these are just some photos that demonstrate that, and I'm sure many of you in this room can sympathize with that. So recognize that particularly if you're working with a land trust that owns fee land, or you're a town, you're that anchor point. I think you play a disproportionately important role in that landscape. You have likely land that is larger than the parcel surrounding it. It has ecological value, oftentimes disproportionately. That's why it was oftentimes conserved. And it oftentimes has disproportionate social value. It's where people will hike and sort of connect with nature and so forth. So can we think about your lands, state lands, town lands, land trust lands, as those anchor points, and then think about the areas around them and using that as an opportunity to communicate with landowners and say, this is what we're thinking about here on our conservation land. And this is why we're thinking about it. Do you have some overlapping interests? If we did this here and you complemented that on your land, we'd be increasing the structural complexity, or we'd be increasing the kind of habitat. So I think particularly in our highly parcelized landscape, we have to look across those stone walls. You play a particularly important role, and I think there is an excellent opportunity to use that as a way to engage landowners and create relationships that I believe will lead to better stewardship and, I think, greater land protection because of those relationships.
So what can you do when it comes to ecological forestry and passive forest management? The first piece, what you're likely already involved in, land protection, is huge. If we don't have forests, we're not going to be having these conversations about how they should be managed. So land protection here is essential, keeping our forests from conversion to development or other uses, keeping them as forests. There's options, perhaps considering passive forest management CRs or use areas within those CRs. You could engage in ecological forestry within your fee ownerships. So this could be a diversity of active and passive approaches. Maybe you have a reserve area or a passive stand that you're managing. And as Paul said, you have existing relationships with landowners who see you as a trusted source of information, whether that's your neighbor and you own land and you're chatting with them about management, or you're a land trust. And so serving as a model for others in your community when it comes to forest management. So these are just some things to think about, maybe to start a conversation about passive CRs. Just throughout the survey process, things that have come to mind. With our model, we saw that folks, when it comes to adopting a passive CR, folks who are already enrolled in current use, those who are already considering a CR, and those who see the benefits of passive are more likely to adopt a passive forest management restriction. So these might be the folks that you could consider working with. This could be done either within a conservation easement or within just a specified use area within your easement. I know there's lots of opinions on this about, whether you should just not include areas within an easement instead of developing like a house lot or a homestead area, just leaving that out. So it depends on your organization and what works for you. When it comes to easement language, it could be interesting to consider having a clause where you are obligating the landowner to engage in active management if you do develop an issue with invasive plants or insects that reaches a certain level of intensity where, as Paul was describing, you're not going to get that succession that we're hoping to see because of invasive plants or insects. And then we saw, regardless of the scenario, folks are more interested in adopting passive on just some of their land rather than all of their land. So this could be, again, another case for either using a use area within your conservation easement or perhaps just doing a conservation easement on part of the property. And then we talked about a variety of site characteristics, things to think about, having a variety of physiographic sites, having less invasive insects and plants, places where deer herbivory is not as big of an issue. So there's some things to consider there on where you could be doing these passive CRs. I think with that, it'd be great to have some questions and have a discussion, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you want to add anything?
No. I just wanted to just acknowledge we've got funding from the Highstead Foundation, for which we're very grateful for. Maybe this is why no one's done it. It was hard to find funding to do this. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was not like getting in line to fund this, and so our friends at the Highstead generously came through, and so we're grateful for them and for all the people that spoke with us and helped us come up to speed on this and what they're seeing out in the New England landscape about this. And I want to acknowledge Marla Markowski-Lindsay, who's in the audience, who's just part of the team on Lina's committee and has just been tremendous in terms of the analysis and things. So with that, we left some time because we were hoping people might have questions or want to add some thoughts or experiences. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. That's if you didn't hear, the question was, how does passive management mesh with or not mesh with the Chapter 61 program? And I'm assuming you mean 61 specifically. So there's 61, 61A, and 61B. With 61B, it meshes really well because that's a passive program, so that's sort of a no-brainer. The Chapter 61 program does allow for areas within it to not be managed. It wasn't originally conceived like that. There were areas, inaccessible areas, wetlands and so forth that frankly just they're a part of the ecosystem, so why take those out? So there are limits as to how much of your land you can put into that as a proportion of your total acreage. So you couldn't get into Chapter 61 and say I'm doing all passive, but for those landowners, and apparently there are more landowners that want to do it on some of their land than all of their land, that might work for them, that they could be in 61 actively managing and creating sort of these patch reserves or designating stands and still fall within Chapter 61. I would encourage you to talk to your local service forester for more details, I guess, in terms of the nuances.
Is there a given percentage?
There is, and I don't know, I'm stumbling. I don't know if it's 25%. That's why I would encourage you to talk to I knew it at one time when I was young. Yes?
So Paul, is there a difference in the tax reduction for folks in 61 versus 61B?
Yes, absolutely. So in 61, the tax rate is based on stumpage values, like how much value you're growing, and that those tend to be lower. So in other words, you're saving more taxes in Chapter 61. In Chapter 61B, it's a strict 75% reduction. So you're paying 25% of the taxes. So typically in 61, it's less. Yeah.
So thinking about that,
Yeah.
if I were a community and the landowner came to taxpayer consent, under my Chapter 61 program, I'd like to put 50% of my land in passive. Why would they not agree to that?
Oh, you mean because they'd be getting a little more revenue?
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to think about it, Dick. I guess I always think about the other way, which is how do you incentivize landowners? But from the town, it might be. And so for me, it becomes a question of, well, should they be the same? But from the town perspective, they're getting a little bit more revenue.
If you incentivize the town, and they're willing to allow it, landowners will go to that.
Yeah.
They'll-
Yeah, and as Lina's results show, that current use program does tend to be the preferred scenario. So thinking that through, and again, these current use programs were developed decades ago, and this is a rather new-ish conversation. So there are opportunities to turn the knobs up and down on some of those policy tools to encourage or not. Yeah.
I'm curious, and apologies if you said it and I missed it, but in the survey, did you consider a question around like ownership tenure and generational ownership and familial claims and how that works out?
Regrettably, we did not, but that's a great point. If we could do another survey or could go back in time, that's definitely something that we would have looked at.
You mean in terms of passing the land on and whether that was influential, where they got the land from?
Yeah, I'm just curious on like the demographics of the survey and like what the response would have been. I mean, I imagine it's probably a mixed bag, but just if a family's owned the land for generations and utilize that land for various activities, they might be on one side of the spectrum, but at the same time, the newer generation inheriting the land might be much more approachable on the passive. So,
Yeah, it's an insightful comment, and Marla is nodding her head because well, go ahead, Marla.
Yeah, no, it would have been a good question to ask. And I do think that, when people have estate planning and they constantly run to other lands for their heirs, that can have an influence on what they want to do. And also, there's place taxes too, and you think about what the family has done on that land in the past and what you want to leave going forward.
Yeah, we see in our past work, we see that landowners that have inherited their land do act differently when it comes to conservation-based estate planning, and that could cut both ways. It could be that they are more interested in making sure they got it handed down, so they feel responsible to make sure they get it, they hand it down to someone else. But it may also be they want to make sure they hand it down with all the options like they got it. So there is definitely an ethic to that, but it can cut both ways. Yeah, sir. Oh, go ahead. Front row and then second row. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So I work for a town, and it seems like the passive approach seems like as somebody who's the only person in the conservation division, I love the idea, for Chapter 97 land. And so what I'm thinking is this would be something I'd want to see what landowners are interested in participating in this when it comes to future land acquisition, wanting to say, okay, we have a passively managed town land near you, using that as because when it comes to buying land, we have to think about priority land.
Sure.
And so I was curious if as this goes on, do you think there'll be a way that you can use it to see which lands are participating in a public way to then inform us on when we should be putting funding towards which lands we want to acquire?
No. So I guess I would suggest that might be a better local neighborhood conversation. It's the opportunity to build relationship with people. You can communicate what you're doing and why, and there might be those around you that really that resonates with and they want to add to it, and it's the opportunity for you to start that conversation. And they're like everything else, there probably are landowners that won't be. I don't know. David, do you have other thoughts? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. It's just what you do.
I would agree with you. I think it really is an opportunity to have that conversation on a local or neighborhood kind of basis.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Sir, second row.
Yeah, in the survey, and I apologize if
Go
you
ahead.
did this and I missed it. When you asked them if they passively manage some versus all their property, did you ask them for a percentage, or was it just a qualified yes or no?
Yeah, so we didn't, when asking about if they're already doing it, that was just they could check that they were already doing it. And then for some or all of my land, that was as specific as it got. So we don't have any percentages, unfortunately, but that would be really interesting to look at.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, because if a landowner, they built on a very small portion of their land, right? And if they answer that question as, oh no, we don't passively manage it, just because they build on it, but they really haven't, done any active management on the rest, how do they interpret that question?
Yeah. Yeah, it's unfortunately just like putting a flag in the sand at this point, because there hasn't been anything else done. So just trying to get kind of a coarse picture of what's going on. But yeah, it's a challenge with survey research. The more thinking that you require of your respondents, the more questions that you include, the lower the response rate. So there are so many things that we would have included in this survey, but wanting to make sure that we got a substantial enough of returns,
And it's great work that you've done. I didn't mean to.
Yeah, no, not at all.
No,
That's
it's
a
great
point.
thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a natural next step is like, all right, what do you mean by some of your land? Like what is, and to explore that a little further. But to Lina's point, Lina's got like 4 papers she could get out of this. I mean, because we already had a lot, because we're geeky and we're like, oh, let's ask that. But then at some point it becomes too much. Yeah. Any other thoughts or observations? People doing it? Yeah.
No, I just wondered if there was any studies as far as invasives on passive land versus managed land. Managed land gets much more open. I don't know, is there any research on that?
Tom or Paul or Andy, do you want to field that?
That's a good question. Land use history, I think, is maybe more important than what we're doing right now, I think, in terms of explaining broadly in the landscape where invasives are. But yeah, I think passively managed sites tend to be less likely to be invaded than actively managed sites.
Yeah, that active forest management, it's a disruption, right? And it's breaking, the canopy, and that's what you want. You want sunlight to regenerate trees, but other things regenerate as well. Right. So that's something to be conscious of. And that's also one of the things from a siting perspective. If it's there in great numbers, or it's at knocking on the door, may or may not be. You got to consider that in terms of which direction you go. Yeah, all the way in the back.
One of the issues about 61 and having the land in 61 for people that don't know how it works is that it's a cumulative reduction in taxes over time. So the whole idea is that if you put your property in 61, that over a period of 10 years, 20 years, the taxes that you've deferred are, when the property changes hands, an incentive to keep it in farmland and not develop it. And when you have situations like the property around here, where it's in high demand, it becomes much less of an incentive to someone that buys the property and says, I can put 15 houses on that, I'll pay off that $100,000 that's due. And economically, what your intention was doesn't carry over the way that it would in a permanent easement. So one of the things that I would have liked to have seen was economic factors in some of the areas that you were studying, because I think that Chapter 61 is a lot more effective where property values haven't accelerated to the point where paying off that residual tax isn't a deterrent.
Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about that?
That's a great point, and we're trying to think about ways to look at development pressure, and so I'm at the very beginning of looking at a spatial analysis of our data, because we have centroids for the people who responded to the survey, and so we could look at that, looking at proximity to low, medium, high density development. Or my old land trust that I worked for in Western New York, we would always look at whether or not the road had utilities on it existing, because roads that already had water, electric, were quicker to be developed. So there's some things that we can look into on that, but that's certainly an important context to include.
Any other thoughts or questions? Lynn and I can stick around. I just want to say, if you don't remember anything else from the talk, please don't get put into a corner of choosing active or passive, that we need both across the landscape. Think about your property, the context of it, and have these conversations. We need it all across the landscape, and don't, we need all of those values. So let's think about it as a whole instead of something adversarial. Thank you for your time, and we'll stick around if you have any questions. Have a great conference.
Thank you.